E ala ua aua malama lama ua hele ka naka aya I luna ua kai o kai ho ka ula ka ho ka le. Now I hoa ka pua wa uli pua wa kea moa kani moa hini mahi ki na kau lali ka lani. O wau ka liu liu e he aka. O ke aka no ya mai ka hiki ku, mai ka hiki moe, mai ka hiki kapa kapa we e ka ne. E aka pure ka wai oha. E anai a we te atua. E ola noe.
Aloha mai kako. Welcome everyone from New York City, where I am moderating this webinar on behalf of the G20 Interfaith Forum's Anti-Racism Initiative. My name is Audrey Kitagawa. I was born and raised in Hawaii and still maintain my residence there. The Anti-Racism Initiative explores the ramifications of racism in historical as well as contemporary contexts and the institutional, systemic, and structural ways in which racism is perpetuated. Today, we will hear how the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Island communities face their unique challenges with racism, as well as climate change and the rising oceans, which jeopardize their well-being and island homes. Our deepest appreciation to Mr. Cole Durham and Ms. Catherine Marshall, the President and Vice President of the G20 Interfaith Forum, respectively, for their support of the Anti-Racism Initiative. I would also like to thank all of the dedicated and committed members of the Anti-Racism Initiative Working Group, whose mission is to examine racism, its root causes and its solutions, and offer its insights and recommendations for consideration by the G20 leaders. President Joseph R. Biden, on his first day in office, signed an executive order advancing racial equity in the federal government, and in his first week in office, issued a presidential memorandum condemning racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders. One of our panelists today is Krystal Ka'ai, who was recently appointed by President Biden to be the executive director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. The elevation of the issues of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities at the federal level in the United States is a significant step in bringing these issues forward to national and international awareness. I will be introducing each of the speakers in turn, and our panelists have dedicated much of their life's work to issues of social and racial justice and empowering and educating Native Hawaiian and Pacific Island communities. We will start our conversation today with Krystal Ka'ai. In her role as the executive director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, which I will contract with the acronym NHPI. She is responsible for directing the efforts of the White House Initiative and Presidential Advisory Commission on NHPI, advising the Biden administration on the implementation and coordination of federal programs as they relate to NH and PI across executive departments and agencies. Krystal, thank you for joining us today. And you indicated that COVID-19 highlighted the systemic barriers to equity, justice, and opportunity that Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders have faced for far too long and have too often been rooted in racism, intolerance, and other forms of hate. You also indicated President Biden has reinstated and reinvigorated the historic White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. Would you please share with us these systemic barriers to justice, equity, and opportunity that you have observed, and how your role as executive director of this White House initiative will be addressing this issue. Krystal, you now have the floor.
Well, thank you so much, Chair Kitagawa, and aloha mai kako. I want to thank the G20 Interfaith Forum Anti-Racism Initiative for the opportunity to join you today for this important discussion on the systemic racial challenges facing Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. I deeply admire the work of the G20 Interfaith Forum and all that you are doing to examine systemic racial challenges and barriers in our society. And I am so honored to be on this panel alongside so many esteemed leaders in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community, and having the privilege to share the Biden administration's view and vision of the work that we as a society must tackle in order to address systemic racism and inequality, both in the United States and internationally. As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic has taken a severe economic, health, and spiritual toll on all communities, and we have certainly seen this impact in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. And so as part of our whole of government response to addressing inequities that have longstanding inequities that have been exacerbated by the pandemic, President Biden on day one in office signed an executive order to advance racial equity through the federal government and acknowledged that there are entrenched disparities in our laws, policies, and institutions that have long denied equal opportunity to many in our country. Within his first week in office, the president issued a presidential memorandum on condemning and combating racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. And in March, he issued a fact sheet describing further actions that the administration is taking to combat hate. In May, during what is considered Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, the president issued a proclamation to recognize the month of May, and for the first time actually explicitly named the Native Hawaiian community in that proclamation, defining the month as Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. And later that month, he actually signed the executive order that created my position, Executive Order 14031, to advance equity, justice, and opportunity for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community in the United States. And the order that reestablished this initiative, which we are calling, which the acronym is WEONP, delivers on the president's longstanding commitment to reinstate and reinvigorate this historic initiative, but also to ensure that there is an ambitious whole of government effort to ensure that there is equity, justice, and opportunity for the AA and NHPI community advanced throughout the entire US federal government. And I have the tremendous honor and responsibility to serve as the first Native Hawaiian executive director of this initiative. And it is an honor that I am and privilege, again, I am so grateful for, because it really does show the president's commitment, the president of the United States' commitment to ensuring that the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community has a voice at the highest levels of our federal government. The work of the initiative, as we know, is more important now than ever, as our community and our entire world continues to address the devastating impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we all know that the past year and a half has been unlike any other. And like other communities of color, the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community has been devastated by the disproportionate health and economic impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. But even long before the pandemic, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders have had a harder time accessing healthcare, accessing a number of programs offered by the United States federal government due to a number of barriers, including both language and cultural barriers that have historically made these programs inaccessible to many within our community. And so because of this, we also have noticed that because the community is extremely diverse, we talk about Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders using that broad term, but we know we're talking about so many more. When we say Pacific Islanders, we're talking about Samoans, we're talking about Fijians, we're talking about those from the Marshall Islands. And so Chamorros, there's so much diversity within the rich diaspora of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community. And yet within the United States, oftentimes that diversity is masked and aggregated with data for the Asian American population. And when that happens, unfortunately, we are unable to see a number of the disparities that exist. And the COVID-19 pandemic is a great example of that. Throughout the pandemic in the United States, the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community has been among the hardest hit. It has faced significant infection and mortality rates. And in fact, actually has one of the highest mortality rates out of any racial group, including the African American community and Latino community in the United States and several states. And yet that narrative is something that is not often told because our data is often masked or not included. So Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are often listed as other, or as I mentioned earlier, they are lumped into the category of Asian American and Pacific Islander, which masks, again, many of the disparities that we have been able to see on the ground. And so one of the mandates that the initiative is charged with is to address data disaggregation and look at systemic issues to address these challenges so that we can better understand and address significant disparities that exist between diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander subpopulations. So that is a big charge of what I have been tasked to do through the current initiative. Another longstanding barrier has been language access and cultural competency. And, for the Native Hawaiian population that is Indigenous, it's a colonized population, has had its language stripped from, culturally and historically, and yet has, and has worked to revitalize that language. We are seeing a different, pattern there. They're not facing the same language access barriers that we are seeing with other Pacific Islander populations. From especially we are seeing that from our COFA communities, our Compact of Free Association communities in the United States, who do have significant language barriers and have struggled to get resources from both the federal and state governments in the United States translated into their languages, and to have that culturally competent outreach to ensure that they are getting the care that they need throughout the COVID pandemic, whether it's to address health disparities or to address significant unemployment. So these are all very significant things that the initiative is working to do. There is so much work ahead and so much that I am excited to do in this new role as the executive director of the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. So I want to thank you again, Audrey, and the G20 Interfaith Summit for inviting me to be a part of today's discussion. Mahalo nui loa.
Thank you so much, Krystal. And Reverend Dr. Upolu Luma Vaai is a professor of theology and ethics and principal of the Pacific Theological College in Suva, Fiji, which is owned by 20 Pacific churches spread throughout 16 countries of the region. And his research interests are Pacific Indigenous philosophies and spiritualities, theology, decolonizing education, and climate change. He is a pioneer of the relational Renaissance movement in the Pacific to critically address racial coloniality in the dominant development narrative. His publications include The Relational Self, Decolonizing Personhood in the Pacific, and Relational Humanetics, Decolonizing the Mindset of the Pacific, Int'l. Now, Professor Reverend Vaai, you had indicated that apart from COVID-19, climate change is the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the Pacific peoples. You also indicated that the way it is addressed by the international community invites racial divides and dynamics that mostly affect those in the grassroots communities who bear the brunt of climate change. And I'd like you to share with us what you mean by this and how this has affected the grassroots communities in Fiji. You now have the floor.
Thank you, Audrey. In the Pacific, apart from the COVID-19 overwhelming some of the countries, climate change, as I said, is the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the peoples. Traditionally, we used to associate racism with slavery. In the Pacific, blackbirding was the #1 slavery system, where Pacific people were snatched from their homes and shipped to Australia, Fiji, Samoa, and Hawaii, and other parts of the Pacific for indentured labor. While some argue it is not comparable to the transatlantic slavery movement, the Pacific slavery movement was very subtle. However, some of the principles of traditional slavery are still embedded in our development models today, including climate strategies, such as class and status, race and power, and profit, to name a few. I want to reflect how these slavery principles shape climate change today. First, I do agree with science critical a role of raising important information about global warming and the importance of lowering emissions to 1.5 Celsius according to the Paris Agreement. But sometimes also science needs a human face. It needs a spirituality. It needs a core of emotion and feeling, or else it is just a dry system about facts and data. The climate change narrative has been one-sided, focusing only on science at the expense of spirituality, which sometimes is very Western and elitist. Climate change discussion has been influenced by a colonial racial narrative where spirituality is seen as a threat to legal secular frameworks because, as they say, it's intangible, therefore hard to measure compared to how they measure GDP. In the Pacific, spirituality is at the heart of faith in indigenous communities. The compartmentalization of life into categories such as science versus spirituality, private versus public, male versus female, secular versus sacred, to name a few, are racial stratification by the colonial masters based on hierarchy of status and power to classify what they see as the weakest and uncivilized category. To dismiss spirituality is a racial tragedy that eliminates peoples and communities whose life depend on spirituality of their lands and oceans. We are Moana people. We are large ocean countries, not small island countries. To change this narrative, we need a spirituality, to bring in spirituality into the climate change picture. Second, the international climate agreements have often been dictated by the narrative and ideologies of the big and rich countries. For example, when rich Western countries put the Pacific into labels such as small island countries or sinking islands, drowning peoples, or vulnerable Pacific, already there is an assumption that these islanders and these countries are the uncivilized race that need to be saved. Hence is the continuation of the notion of a Western savior to save the Black and brown uncivilized. For the colonial project to work, it needs to create an ideology that every culture is uncivilized and not up to Western standard, therefore need to be saved. This narrative goes back to the colonial missionary mandate, where the Black and brown bacons and savages need to be saved by a superior race from the curse of their own cultures. Racism around the world is a testament to the continuance of a colonial framework, where non-Europeans are often viewed as less than or the other. Pacific Islanders are now doing it to their own brothers and sisters. So Pacific people are not immune from this racial discrimination acts. We need to promote a climate narrative that these islanders have a sustainable culture, a system of well-being, a language that is deeply shaped by Earth consciousness. We need national adaptation plans that consider indigenous models and climate adaptation strategies that have been developed and tested throughout many centuries that still work today. Because these strategies have not been tested scientifically in the West does not mean they don't work. This is a racist way to undermine how non-Western communities live. Pacific Islanders have an experiential performance-based approach to life, where these traditional climate strategies are tested daily through action and reflection. Thirdly, we need to rethink the notion of sin that the church preaches every Sunday. Moving from a kind of privatized notion of sin that focuses on a series of personal wrongdoings that has embedded Western Christianity to condemn and demonize other non-Western cultures to a systemic notion of sin, we need to acknowledge that there is something called ecological sin, or in this case, climate sin. The depth of the Christian notion of sin is not touched if we do not own up to the social and ecological destruction our development economic systems have incurred. Anything that destroys life and distorts the well-being of peoples and the earth is sin. For example, we need to expose the sin of deep sea mining that is now moving in fast pace in Nauru, in Tonga, in Kiribati, and the Clarion-Clipperton zone south of Hawaii. Mining companies are interested in investing in the Pacific Moana's rich polymetallic nodules that could power 1 billion electric vehicles in the future. Mining companies in Canada are leading this venture. We need to expose the sin of the violation of human and land rights in West Papua, in Kanaki, New Caledonia, in Guam, Hawaii, and other parts of Pacific by militarized powerful nations such as the US, France, Indonesia, to name a few. We need to expose the sin of extractive economies that have contributed to the displacement and statelessness of climate refugees. We need to discuss in climate international forums and in the UN to what extent the rights of these refugees have if they are relocated. Would they still have land and cultural rights in their new locations that they will be relocated to? We need to discuss the sin of nuclear testings and its relation to the notion of loss and damage, for example, where France, for example, continues to deny responsibility for the loss of many lives and consequences on the health and people of French Polynesia during their nuclear testings from 1966 to 1996. All of these climate change related developments are one way or the other inextricably connected to the slavery principles that I mentioned before of either race or power, class or status, or profit. Thank you, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Professor Vaai. And I'd like to call upon now Keone Nakoa and give you some background about Keone. He is a Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, a semi-autonomous state agency established through the Hawaii State Constitution and mandated to better the conditions of Native Hawaiians. In this position, he serves as a liaison between OHA and all branches of the federal government as OHA fulfills its mandate through advocacy, research, and community engagement at the federal level. Keone's prior experience in Washington, D.C. includes serving as a legislative correspondent and speechwriter for the late U.S. Senator Daniel Akaka. Keone, as the D.C. Bureau Chief for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs and as a native Hawaiian, please share what are the historical disparities and inequities faced by Hawaiians at the local, state, and federal levels, which you indicated include health, education, housing, the criminal justice system, and violence against women. Keone Nakoa, thank you.
Aloha kako, and mahalo nui loa Audrey and the G20 Interfaith Forum for hosting this strong panel today to discuss these important topics, the systemic racism and challenges faced by the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. As you mentioned, my name is Keone Nakoa and I'm the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief for the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. And I guess maybe by way of answering the question, I kind of thought it would be helpful to go over some of the historical contexts of Native Hawaiians and dispel some of the information that I think too often, at least on the Hill in DC, we see information that isn't necessarily well known, or sometimes misunderstood. And so in that vein, I appreciate the opportunity to help raise awareness about the history of Hawaii and Native Hawaiians, our status as the Indigenous, once sovereign people of the state of Hawaii, who have never given up our right to self-determination, and then talk a little bit more about the mission and work of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. So since that's kind of a lot to cover, jumping right in. Native Hawaiians are the Aboriginal Indigenous people who settled the Hawaiian archipelago, now known as Hawaii, as early as 300 AD, and eventually founded the Kingdom of Hawaii. We exercise sovereignty over our islands in a highly organized, self-sufficient, subsistent social system based on a communal land tenure system with a sophisticated language, culture, and religion. Prior to the arrival of the non-indigenous people to the Hawaiian archipelago, as many as 1 million Native Hawaiians built a thriving, complex society capable of completely self-sustaining itself off of the land and the ocean in one of the most remote locations in the world. Native Hawaiian society, under the leadership of its government, was among the most advanced and educated in the world at its time. By 1839, for example, the Hawaiian education system was so successful that Native Hawaiian literacy rate exceeded all but 2 nations in the world. The Hawaiian Kingdom became just the 5th country to require compulsory education for all youth in 1841. Unfortunately, for the Native Hawaiians, Hawaii is located in a very strategic location in the middle of the Pacific Ocean between the United States and Asia. And partially because of that, as a result, for much of the 19th century, Westerners became increasingly involved in the economic and political affairs of the kingdom. Following the 1893 overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii by American and European sugar planters and the descendants of missionaries with the help of the United States military, the Republic of Hawaii was established, but the Native Hawaiians never relinquished our claims to self-determination at the time and continued to protest the illegal overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani. However, Native Hawaiians, despite not giving up our right to self-determination, did endure generations of the erasure of our cultural identity. Even in the kingdom days, Western assimilation policies began to enter into the education system through American channels. Their assimilation policies were a significant part of the United States' relationship with the Native Hawaiian community at the time and were carried out in American missionary schools, boarding schools, and day schools that extended into the territorial government days and then on through statehood. In 1898, President McKinley of the United States sought to implement the existing US policies of assimilation and land allotment against Native Hawaiians by annexing Hawaii to the United States. The self-declared Republic of Hawaii ceded 1,800,000 acres of kingdom lands to the United States without the consent or compensation to Native Hawaiian people or our sovereign government. The historians will additionally note that the territorial government, whose legislative structure and executive were dictated by the United States federal government, banned the speaking of Native Hawaiian language in schools and legislative proceedings, and adopted policies to assimilate Native Hawaiians into the American society at the expense of the Native Hawaiian language, culture, and traditional practices. For decades, Native Hawaiians continued to suffer the increasing erasure of our cultural identity, political disenfranchisement by the ruling oligarchy, and degradation as a people, being called lazy and ignorant. Native Hawaiians were deemed by the governor, one of the governors at the time, to be a menace to good government in our own lands. By the 1920s, the Native Hawaiian population had decreased to just 20 to 40,000 from, again, a time where pre-contact, some estimates range anywhere from 600,000 to as high as 1 million. If not for the period now known as the Hawaiian Cultural Renaissance of the 1970s and the pioneers and heroes who led that movement, many of our Native Hawaiian language, traditions, and culture may have been lost forever. In fact, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is a direct result of the renaissance of the Native Hawaiian culture and values in that state. As I said, in the 1970s, there was a vast movement of musicians, artists, historians, and aspiring politicians at the time, now established politicians, that led a movement in Hawaii and established in 1978 the Office of Hawaiian Affairs in Article 12 of our Constitution. As you mentioned, it's a semi-autonomous state agency of the state of Hawaii mandated to better the conditions of Native Hawaiians. We're guided by a board of publicly elected trustees. Hawaii state law recognizes the Office of Hawaiian Affairs as the principal public agency in the state responsible for our performance. As the Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief, our office plays an important role in working with members of Congress, federal agencies, and partners to address all of the disparities that we unfortunately see today. We primarily work to promote policies and programs to better the conditions of Native Hawaiians and often all Native American communities, be that American Indian, Alaska Native, or Native Hawaiians. And one of our main aspects is to identify and address some of those disparities. Unfortunately, I know that I'm running low on time, so I'm hoping to be able to come back and speak a little bit more to some of those disparities in healthcare, violence against women, and the criminal justice system, as you mentioned.
Thank you so much, Keone. And I'd like to now invite Okenaisa Fauolo-Manila, who is the director of the Samoan Studies Institute at American Samoa Community College, or ASCC. She received her bachelor's and master's degrees and diploma of teaching in social sciences from Waikato University, New Zealand. She has taught history and geography at Samoa College, Sacred Hearts College, and ASCC. She is a recipient of ASCC Teacher of the Year Award, and she published a bilingual guide to understanding cancer-related terminologies in English and Samoan. Okenaisa, you had indicated that some of the major challenges in American Samoa are inevitable when we think globally and about the need to stay connected. You said there is wisdom in American Samoa's past that we can use to address some of the issues we have today in our society. And I'd like you to share with us what the major changes are in American Samoa that you have observed and how the wisdom of its past can be used to address its issues today. Okenaisa, you now have the floor.
Aftai Audrey. Patuloma, Patalofa, Atilne Asu, Malolso Manuia. Warm greetings from American Samoa, the only U.S. territory in the South Pacific. And of course, we are the last island to see the sunset. And congratulations, Reverend Vaai, for Fiji winning gold for the sevens rugby. It's overwhelming to hear what has been shared so far by our prestigious panel this morning. And I have prepared my 7 minutes, but in hearing all that has been said, I could only then go back to what Audrey said to me, be authentic and speak as it. You may also hear with my utmost respect is that dealing with state and whatnot, oh man, that's so not my piece of pie. So when I think of racism, how it's being institutionalized and well-rooted in the processes we live by, for us here in American Samoa, just to highlight that challenge, our language of instruction is English. A couple of years ago, I testified at the Senate for the bill to have the Samoan language used as our primary language of instruction. The bill didn't pass. And I came back with the thought, if God's gift to Samoa is language, I am not going to work at that level, that state where you people are. I'm just going to go with what I know and the little niche that I have. And so, because to even also try in the higher the institution of higher learning, because we also answer to accreditation to ask. And while we all speak the importance of diversity, yet our policies takes forever to be inclusive enough to have Samoan language as a, to place our students. Now, that has yet to be approved. So in my own small niche, that I went ahead and offered placement testing for students who are taking Samoan. The result overall is we're below average. And so having the attitude then and singing Bill Ocean's song that when the going gets tough, the tough get going, I then prefer to work at this level because the ironies can be so much. We, as American Samoa, may be part of a population, when we speak population-wise, that we are increasing. But in using of our native language, we are decreasing. So, that's one irony. The other irony is that, yes, we support using of your language, inclusion and whatnot. But when it comes to the reality of trying to embed such, then the support somehow is slippery. And so I'm very thankful for President Biden's initiative. And so, because to be part of this, it gives me hope. I'm speaking for myself. It gives me hope. It makes me continue to believe that what I'm working for is valid. So what can I contribute to our discussion this morning is that, and this is my grassroots approach to this issue, that the globe way too above me. So at my small niche is that, one, I teach the students and I teach the community of being grounded in my Samoanness. And my Samoanness is part of surviving in our global environment. And I believe, looking at our panel, the mere fact that, with all respect to Reverend Vaai, to you, Madam Moderator, you're from small places, yet you have made it. And hearing you with your introductions and what your culture. And so that's what I push with our students, with our community, is part of surviving this global environment is knowing your culture. So in my situation is that knowing my Samoanness, and that my culture has been around for 3,000 years, and Lord help me that I'm gonna make another 3,000 years more. And two is that I know my story. Sometimes we use our stories, we repeated stories to keep people, feel bad and feel small about themselves. But the story of Samoa, though, is that knowing the story that you are a survivor, like what Bob Marley's, song, I know Bob Marley's dead, but like what he sings, if you don't know your history, then you don't know where you're coming from. And so this is one major challenge that we with our students, with our community, is telling the stories. Well, there is the issue with the textbook. We have an issue with that. But you also have to tell them who wrote the history, who benefit from it. Okay, now you need to listen to what I am telling you. It cannot, maybe it's not because traditionally we are oral society. And in this contemporary world, we will still be oral society. So with the need of knowing your language, because then when I speak your story, it will go to your heart. And when the heart speaks, you will survive. So, with American Samoa, since 1900, we became unique. And I know from the United Nations perspective is that American Samoa is a colony. And in my head, I said, no, we're not. Well, I understand what colony means, what being colonized is. All of us share what it is. But the ongoing process of dialoguing, of partnership, because we don't see ourselves as a colony. We're free. We have a partnership with the United States, and we would love to keep it that way, whereby we are Americans, but we're also Samoans. And since 1900, so it's always the more challenge come into place is when we try to find that balance. And so that's the challenge. And so that's why with my approach and my contribution here, know the story. Do we have to know American history? Yes, we have to know the American story, but we must also know our Samoan story. And so, you know, and these are the things that I do to inspire, to make sure that we still survive the dynamics of our environment. And my last point I wanted to say, to share with our panelists today is that Samoan have always been, and I am so sure Hawaiians have the same. It's a sharing of the moana, has been mentioned by Reverend. It's that we are a part of the environment. It's an integral part of the environment. We're not above, we're not in it. We are part of it. We have Samoanized many things. Be it you call it with the missionaries coming in, we Samoanized the Christianity. We Samoanized our relationship with the United States because we internalize it. Even with the climate change and even when being condemned that you're sinking, we know that this is our space and we will continue because we know we're part of it. We will save it. So like Billy Ocean's song goes, when the going gets tough, the tough get going. Thank you so much for my time.
Thank you so much, Okenaisa, for your beautiful sharing. And I'd like to now turn the floor over to Dr. Manulani Aluli Meyer. And she grew up on the sands of Mokapu and Kailua Beach on the island of Oahu, and along the rainy shoreline of Hilo, Paliku. The Aluli Ohana, or family, is a large and diverse group of scholar activists dedicated to Hawaiian education, restorative justice, land reclamation, Ohana health practices, cultural revitalization, arts education, prison reform, transformational economics, food sovereignty, and Hawaiian music. She works in the field of Indigenous epistemology and its role in worldwide awakening. She obtained her doctorate in philosophy of education from Harvard, and she works at the University of Hawaii, West Oahu campus. Manulani, you said these beautiful words. Loving is a practice of an awake mind. And you asked, what does this have to do with anti-racist approaches to issues within Oceania? If Hawaii has a say in how the world evolves, everything. Now, please share what you meant by that and your observations about the challenges of Native Hawaiians, please. Now, Manulani, you have the floor.
Ui, aloha mai kakoa pau e ku'umauhoa, aloha mai. Audrey, thank you for that. Oh my gosh. And Okenaisa, mahalo nui no ko ike nahe nahe. Such a beautiful clarity you bring to this kaupapa. Krystal, we're so proud of you. Really, thank you for being there and standing steady for our peoples. And Keone, wow, that context, we've got so much to talk about, you know, and so you did that really well, Keone. The quasi-official thing of, oh, that was kind of funny. What does that mean? And of course, Upolu. Oh, you are my beloved friend. Thank you for bringing us to the clarity of all false dualities. That's what I'm talking about, Audrey. I'm talking about what Upolu is bringing forward with his work on relationality, with his work on describing the situation we're at and why we're not responding with ancient wisdom systems. Epistemicide is a worldwide phenomenon because of power and ignorance and racism. The death of our native knowledge system has been recovering in the last 50 years since our cousins are beginning to know each other, support each other, sail to each other's islands and be welcomed. And in that welcome, we revive our cultural practices. One of my favorite quotations is from Krishnamurti, a worldwide leader I happen to have met in the 70s in Ojai, California. He said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." So here we go. That's what I believe you are saying, Okenaisa, that we are technically occupied, but my mind is not colonized. We are technically a part of the United States. So now it's time for us to help. Now it's time for us to help this youthful society to evolve. So Krystal, you guys are on it. You must bring forward our Ike Kupuna. Keone, you know what I'm talking about. And Upolu, the systems of well-being that are centered on earth consciousness is aloha aina. If I could summarize Indigenous epistemology in one sentence, it's love land, serve people. Love land, serve people. Oh, wait a minute. It's serve land, love people. It's the same differently. So this is why I want to tell all you folks in this anti-racist initiative, it's really, that is just a moment of discussion, because we have our olelo no eao, hahai no ka'ua I ka ulu la'au, plant a forest and the rains will come. Or the noahuna is share purpose with others and your life will have meaning. Share purpose with others and your life will have meaning. And that's what, Audrey, you're doing. You're sharing your purpose with a wider group of practitioners, scholar practitioners, and everybody has their excellence, everybody. Here's another olelo no eao. He puko'a kani aina, one of my favorites. He puko'a kani aina. Kani is like to make a sound. The coral sounds out for land. Our coral, we know, grows from one to the many and from the many to the one. And so that is the mystical saying that Upolu is bringing forward in this concept of spirituality. It is not religion. Please do not mistake the bureaucracy of spirituality. Religion is the bureaucracy. Spirituality is like the great-great-grandmother. She operates in a trans-spatial understanding that knows that things might not be measured, but oh my goodness, they can be experienced. Yay, Upolu. And that's the nature of our times. We are bringing forward the pono, the consistency of our trans-spatial realities. And my work is in the efficacy of aloha. Now, people might think that aloha is this, that, and the other, but let me tell you, it is the undeniable source of all values. The genesis, the source, the alpha and omega of our thinking and of our being. And you know what I mean? I know you all know that, but to call the energetic field of how we're going to get out of this mess, we have to give it something tangible. And that tangibility, of course, is the intangible. I love the conundrums, because those conundrums are what makes life worthwhile. And this is the nation. This is the time to bring forward our false dualities so we can make them whole again. All right. So people who are versed in ancient well-being systems need to be called forward. And that's our Indigenous practitioners, Indigenous scholars, Native people that already know that our climate has changed. We've seen this for decades now, decades. Are you kidding? We're at 90 degrees on Oahu. So I've come here to plant coconut trees and to take it off the ornamental status in Hawaii and at liability status. If we have a relationship again with the niu, our coconut, things will change. Food security, cultural revitalization, conservation. These are the trilogies that make for our triangulation of meaning and the triangulation we are going to get through to get out of this racist discussion. Racism, for me, is a synonym for ignorance. Racism is a synonym for inequality. And I'd like to introduce my friend Kamuelo Enos's idea of the PEVA model, where we're going to get out of this mess. PEVA is the patch in our wooden bowls that create healing in our broken bowls. It's a beautiful butterfly image. It's beautiful. And he describes it as, Kamuelo Enos describes it as equity, reciprocity, and it's called, what does he call it? Equity, reciprocity, and transparency. Okay, so those three things, Krystal, are a great foundation to look at telling the truth, because once we start to tell the truth, you guys, and like you're doing, Keone, truth heals. Truth is recognized. All these systems begin to deconstruct and reconstruct a different system. So when we do that, equity, reciprocity, and transparency that my friend Kamuela Enos has done in his PEVA model, we will get to the higher frequency. So our kupuna has always taught us to describe the higher frequency, describe the higher. And so equity, reciprocity, and transparency then will become equanimity, simultaneity, and truth. Ta-da! Equanimity, simultaneity, and truth. And this is the purpose of aloha. Ulua e kevelina a ke aloha. Loving is the practice of an awake mind. And now that I've got almost 30 seconds, did you ring the bell, Audrey? Did I hear it? No, I didn't. I just want to tell you, it's really an honor. I try to shake these anti-racist panel guys off, okay? Because we've got to recreate a society. We know it's racist. We know it's racist. I mean, like, so, but let's focus and connect ourselves with the higher frequency, because as Einstein said, the consciousness that solves a problem cannot be the consciousness that developed it. So let aloha and pono, let love and truth wash over us today in this panel, and let us be rigorous about its centrality, purpose, and i'ini of our evolution, not in revolution. I don't want to revolve, I want to evolve. Let's do it together. Join the evolution. Mahalo nui e ke kua na kini kua na auma kua na kupuna kia wahi punahele. Mahalo nui, everyone. Thank you, Audrey. I'm done.
Thank you so much, Manulani. And we're going to start some conversation now, and I'll lead off the conversation by, asking the panel, each of the panelists a question, and then we'll turn it over to our audience to also ask questions. And I'd like to start with Krystal. Krystal, I wanted to ask, why is it important to have Native Hawaiian representation within the U.S. federal government in order to address racism and bias impacting the NHPI community?
Well, thank you for that question, Audrey. I think it's so critical to have representation across the board, whether it is within the U.S. federal government, whether it's at the state level, like Keone with the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Civic engagement is so critical, and one of the mandates outlined in the executive order that created the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders is actually focused on fostering recruitment and career and leadership development for traditionally underserved communities, including those within the Asian American and Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community, to ensure that we do have diverse voices in public service at all levels of the federal workforce in the United States government. That is important because personnel is policy. So having, if we don't have diverse voices at the table, especially in Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, we don't see ourselves reflected in that policy if we don't have people who actively understand our history, understand our challenges, understand our needs. And I think that was what was voiced here. Again, the unique histories of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community are not something, unfortunately, that is often taught in United States history. And that is another mandate of the executive order, to ensure that the histories and representation of our diverse Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community is also uplifted as a way to ensure we are promoting equity, opportunity, and inclusion for this population that has, even within the United States, been traditionally overlooked. And we have very complicated histories. I think that's one thing that has really risen to the surface today. And I think there are oftentimes I speak to those who wonder why someone like me, who is Native Hawaiian, would want to go into service within the federal government. And I know I have colleagues and peers, who don't necessarily see eye to eye, but I do think it is important to have that representation. In Congress, we currently have 4 NHPI or Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander members of Congress, but in a body that is, 541 people total, that is not a lot of representation. And yet that body determines laws and policies that get enacted that impact not just the United States, but the entire global economy. And then the other point is making sure, again, that there are opportunities for the NHPI community, because, again, I've seen so many great policies come out of the current administration due to the fact that we have Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander leaders advocating to ensure that we have inclusive policies that will truly impact our communities. So thank you again, Audrey.
Thank you so much, Krystal. And Keone, how would you describe the historical relationship between the United States and Native Hawaiians? Because we've heard a lot now about this, federal relationship. So please proceed to give us how you feel about this relationship.
Sure. So I think I covered a lot of the history, and I just want to stop and say for a second, mahalo nui from my anu, Dr. Meyer, Manu, for sharing all of the things that you said. I very much felt a lot of that, and I was trying to think about just the other day what aloha means to me, and your description was among the best I've heard. So sorry. To get into the question, so I think the relationship between Native Hawaiians and the United States has had a long history, as I was describing, but currently there is a federal trust responsibility between the United States and the Native Hawaiian people as a Native American, as one of the 3 Native American groups with American Indians, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians. And so to meet this obligation, Congress has enacted many programs and policies to promote education, health, housing, and a variety of other federal programs that together work to enable self-determination. I spoke before about how the United States policies had been assimilationist for many, many years. And those policies had led to the near death of many aspects of our culture. But through that pioneering and leadership of people in the 1970s and through to today, and along with the help of the federal government's programs, we have seen a rebirth in a lot of the Native Hawaiian cultural values, Native Hawaiian language, for example, at University of Hawaii at Hilo. Now you can obtain a PhD in Hawaiian language, and not just in the study of the language. You can obtain it in whatever field of study you want, but Native Hawaiian is the medium. That just knowing that and hearing Okenaisa talk about how the Samoan language is currently being treated back home. It gives me hope and pride to see that from where we were prior to the 1970s, through the Olelo movement, through the Native Hawaiian immersion schools, and I don't think that this is maybe acknowledged enough, a lot of assistance through the federal government, and the programs that were initiated by, in part, Senator Daniel Keakaka, who is a major role model for me, and also Senator Inouye. Those programs have lifted, the support of that programs and our leaders have lifted Native Hawaiian culture and language back up to a place that it is today, where there are children who Native Hawaiian or Hawaiian language has become their native language, essentially. Or at least they're bilingual with English and Hawaiian being spoken primarily in the household. So it is a complicated relationship with the United States. But I think right now, the most important thing that our office promotes is that there is that trust responsibility that exists between the federal government and the Native Hawaiian community, and that is what is needed to be upheld in federal programs and in Congress as we work on policies, and representation, like Krystal was mentioning, is so important to that aspect, because with being able to see a person like Krystal in not just a Native Hawaiian initiative, but a much broader initiative, and at the White House, I think gives a lot of voice to the Native Hawaiian community, and where people maybe grew up, and as I did in the 80s, thinking that Native Hawaiians still had a lot of the stereotypes of that we had. And now there are much more possibilities Native Hawaiians can accomplish, and move forward, and having that representation at that level through Krystal and others will help to address Native Hawaiian issues in the details of policy. And a lot of times that's what's getting glossed over is they'll get the big programs will say something, but when you actually implement, Native Hawaiians somehow get lost in the shuffle. And I think that's a lot of how the systemic racism can play out, and then the disparate impacts will then multiply from there. So
thank you so much, Keone. And now, Professor Vaai, you spoke of climate change and racial dynamics, but how does this narrative influence all other aspects of life in Fiji?
Well, climate change is not just effects on Earth security or economic security as sang by international agreements and communities, because the vanua, the Earth, both skies, land, and sea, is integral to us. Anything that affects ecology affects individuals. So the universe is in us. And normally the international community normally misunderstands this and still struggle to understand why we say that the universe is in us. So for example, the Fijian Int'l peoples, for example, have a cultural spiritual system where each person has a bird representing the skies, a fish representing the ocean, and a tree representing the land. This is now part of the national registry system where Fijians are reminded that they are connected to the cosmos, that the cosmos is part of them. This coherence means that ecology is a transversal that touches every single fabric of life in the Pacific, including spirituality. This interconnectedness and interdependence have already been endorsed and proved by quantum science. And I think Manulani is the one that, very perfect on quantum science, that because we're inextricably linked, when one is affected, all are affected. That is why we must never treat things as a singular one or in binary compartments or categories for the sake of development. We must move away from this uncompassionate economic development model that benefits only a tiny minority of the world that is obsessed with endless growth, primarily based on extraction and exploitation, to one that sees life as an integrated whole. With climate change, it also has consequences on economic, on food, on human, on psychological, cultural, and spiritual security. So climate change affects every aspect of life. So we're not just talking here about economic or physical security. We are talking about the effects on the whole of life. That's why we need to address climate change from a whole perspective, whole of life perspective.
Thank you so much, Professor Vaai. And Okenaisa, how are you using the Samoan language and culture to address some of the issues with respect to the violence in American Samoa?
Oh, thank you for it's just the sharing that we have mentioned so far. So when we go culturally to address these issues, because like I said before, but now we go to the juvenile, we go to the correctional facility, and a lot of them being locked up has to do with violence. And so it's going there, and this is telling them, do you know who you are? And and picking also up on their genealogies, and then reminding them of who they are. Because when they remember who they are, then they go back to the basic of love, of aloha has been, so of being truthful, of pono, of being honest with yourself. And so, and then because once you get that basic of it, where we respect life, and then all the other protocols of being Samoan, of having that relationship with, be it it's a male, between male and male, female, all those should automatically come back to you. And that's how we are using our culture to address these issues, these programs that we have been quite successful in going into our territorial correctional facility and also working with our juvenile. Because honestly, Audrey, I didn't think, I always thought that my culture is perfect. We love everyone, but when being exposed to the juvenile, and then, oh man, it hurts. It hurts. And so now and that's how we use history. That's how we use culture to inspire and to make them remember who they once were. And from there, because once they get that basic of who I am, and then other things fall in place. And the protocols, the rituals that comes with our culture are a lot more easy to hear. And when I say hear, not hearing with their ears, it's hearing with the heart. Yeah, I know for a fact, if you hit the student with the heart, then they will survive. And that's how to address these issues, and we will be at peace instead of retaliating to anything that doesn't go their way. I think that's my answer, and that's how we're using it.
Thank you so much, Okenaisa. And, Manulani, you have acknowledged that racism exists, and I would like to ask, what are the ways you approach conflict as Kanaka Oiwi, which is a native person, as a native Hawaiian? Can you please share with us?
Absolutely. Mahalo nui, Audrey. And mahalo for those responses, Okenaisa. Mahalo nui. Conflict is the midwife of consciousness. That is not me, that's Paulo Freire. And I believe conflict is actually vital for us to understand our gifts. And if we don't work through and with conflict, all we have is conflict. So we here in Hawaii, we've survived a lot of conflict. So we know what Upolu's saying. We know what Keone is trying to access by giving the cultural understanding of our peoples. We have been at the bottom. When I go into prisons and work with our wonderful women, did you know that like close to 95% of our women in prisons, this was 10, 15 years ago, were sexual survivors? So do you understand that as we look at the genesis of conflict, we regain our footing, we are the people who will handle. So conflict is a necessary component to our maturity, to our combining with each other, to our, we have Ololono Eao that teaches us how to behave. It's Ho'okahila Auhe Mihi. The first medicine is forgiveness. And so when we, Auntie Lynette Paglinawan, she's got free courses on this process called Ho'opono. And when you Ho'opono with people, when you keep speaking your truth and you say it with the essence form of what Hawaii is, which is aloha, you will get to a higher frequency of why conflict is necessary. So I'm a twin. I've had conflict my whole life. My twin is a fraternal twin. Her name is Moana. And she, like, beef. So, but now she's my best friend. And so if you're not mentored by difference, all you're going to want to do is neocolonize her, neocolonize it. So when you use conflict as a resource for how to transform into higher frequencies of efficacy, of support, of collaboration, that's why we call, and I'd like to introduce Awamu Kuleana. Awamu Kuleana, I'd like to finish with this, Audrey, is the concept of we carry our own responsibilities, but when you do that well, when you are able to give consciously your excellence, then you combine with others in a mystical process called awamu. Always channel, amu is procreative potential. So awamu kuleana, kuleana is collective transformation to individual excellence. And that's what conflict does. It gets me better because my whole life has been a different form of conflict because of my orientation, because of my sibling status, because of my own slow reading. I don't think I wrote a good sentence till I was 28, and etc. So thank you for that opportunity to introduce Awamu Kuleana, and I'll speak more about it later. Collective transformation through individual excellence. Mahalo.
Thank you so much, Manulani. And we're going to start taking questions from the floor now, but we also have to be mindful of the time. But the first question that was put in, the question and answer, was from David Moore, who says, I am an African American in California. I have read Hawaiian history off and on since I was a teenager, and would like to know my place in your cause. And my yearning brought me to this Zoom today, and how do I support and participate? So Manulani, if you could answer that, because you were mentioning about the higher frequency, higher consciousness, and now you have someone who's from the African American community and wants to know how he can participate. So could you take that question, Manulani?
Thank you for that question. We receive it often here in Hawaii. And you know what I tell everybody is be excellent in your own place. Learn how to be of service to your own family. Learn how to plant food in your own neighborhood. Figure out how to speak the truth and tell the truth at all times. I'm done with large systems. I'm going in to simple family systems and to your own evolution, because your own evolution is an energetic spark that will find others. And I mean it. And I mean it. Because Hawaii is going to be pivotal in saving the planet because of our ancient systems that Upolu has actually defined as systems of well-being. And so we know it's about taking care of your family, taking care of your mother, healing with your brothers, and then taking care of your community. And from that, the outward expansion grows. And I mean it. I mean it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And we have a question from Kay Day, and this is posed to Krystal Ka'ai. And she said, beyond the work you're doing through the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders, could you speak to additional ways that the Biden administration is working to address inequities impacting the NHPI community?
Thank you for that question. I think that's there's so much that I talked about earlier that we are doing specifically through the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. But beyond that, I had mentioned earlier in my remarks that on day one, the President Biden made it a priority to ensure that he issued an executive order to ensure that there is equity throughout the entirety of the United States federal government. And that has never been done before. So we are seeing really transformative change happening within the United States federal government right now. Everything from looking at how are we looking at educational and health disparities, economic disparities and poverty, you name it. There have been so many, unfortunately, disparities exposed and exacerbated because of the current pandemic. But knowing that we have a president currently in the United States who is committed to ensuring we are advancing equity throughout the entirety of the federal government has been extremely inspirational to me. And one of the reasons that I am so honored to have the privilege to lead the White House Initiative on Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders. And one thing I wanted to kind of touch upon, I know this was brought up during our discussion, but climate change is absolutely a threat to our well-being, not just for our NHPI community, but across the entire globe. And so that is another area where the Biden administration has really made a strong commitment to ensuring that we are centering climate justice as part of the work that we are doing. And I will say just one thing I wanted to flag really quickly. The Department of Interior had recently put out a grants notice to solicit ways that the Native Hawaiian community can actually share. It's a pilot program, but on share their international traditional knowledge regarding ways to address climate change by using their cultural knowledge and histories to be able to shape how we are doing policy. So a lot of things like that are really innovative are coming to the forefront and is definitely a top priority for the current administration.
Oh, thank you so much, Krystal. While you have the floor, because we will be concluding now, we have so many questions being asked that there is no way we'll be able to cover them all. So we will have to go into conclusory remarks. And let me just say that to those who have asked questions, we will try our best to have the persons who you have identified posing the question to answer them at a different point in time, and we'll see how we can send you answers. Okay, so Krystal, while you have the floor, your concluding remarks for today, please.
Well, I just want to thank you again, Audrey, and the G20 Interfaith Forum for this opportunity to discuss the many challenges facing the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community, but also the opportunities that we have. I'm so inspired by the discussion that was had today, being able to listen to the mana'o of so many of our speakers, the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander leaders that you've identified. And I think it gives me a lot of hope for the future. There are so many barriers that we must overcome, but collectively our communities are resilient, they are strong, and we have shown that throughout history, time and time again, that we have been able to persist. So again, mahalo nui loa for the opportunity to speak with you today.
Thank you so much, Krystal. And Professor Vaai, your concluding comments, please.
Well, I really admire the sharing that we had today, and thank you to all the panelists. I mean, there is no true humanity without relatedness. The source of lasting good is aloha, as Manulani was talking about, or loloma, as we say in Fiji, not things. Hope is hearing the melody of the future. Relationality is to dance to it. Not prejudice, but openness, not supremacy, but service, not inferiority, but equality, not resentment, but reconciliation. If I may, I would like to end with quoting one of my teachers in Papua New Guinea, the late Bernard Narakobi, who once said, and I quote, "Our history did not begin with contact with Western explorers. Our civilization did not start with the coming of Christian missionaries. Because we have an Asian civilization, it is important for us to give proper dignity and place to our history. We can only be ourselves if we accept who we are rather than denying our autonomy. Now that we are finally with the world, we suddenly see ourselves through the world mirror. Will we see our own true size images? Or will we see ourselves in the images and the shadows of others? Will we see ourselves in the long shadows of the dwindling light and the advanced the darkness of evening dusk? Or will we see ourselves in the long and radiant rays of the rising sun?" So I leave you with those words. But thank you very much, Audrey, and the G20 Interfaith Forum for this kind invitation. Aloha and Modem Manda from here in Fiji, Suva.
Thank you so much, Professor Vaai. And now, Keone, if you could give us your concluding remarks.
Sure. I echo the remarks of everyone else. Mahalo nui loa. I really appreciate just that the G20 Interfaith Forum would have this specific forum, and and like Krystal was saying, it's so important to not sweep the different people into the same group. And too often, a lot of the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander issues get grouped together. And I think I would just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. And because Manulani was saying, I believe racism a lot of times is just ignorance, and I truly believe that is generally the case. I think that there's two things that can be done to kind of move the ball forward on this. And I think the first thing is for people to take the time to learn about the complicated histories of all of our people, not just Native Hawaiians, but all the Pacific Islanders and the Western world as well. Just knowing histories about people are just people, and I think that's the when that education occurs, I think a lot of conflict is able to be resolved in itself. And then the second thing is if people can, from that knowledge, support each other, support one another, demonstrate aloha, and especially in helping empowering each other's and other communities to choose their own self-determination individually and collectively. I think that would be the best, most helpful, effective way forward. So mahalo.
Thank you so much. So now, Okenaisa, if we could hear your concluding remarks, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, again, thanks again for this opportunity. This is my first time on being on a webinar like this. So thank you. And can't be profound like the professors that I am in the midst of, but I can only think Samoan. And like I said in my statement, if I don't for laule to a night, Monet Matayao, literally translated that our past guides, gives us direction for today and tomorrow. And so that encompasses what I believe and what I try and do to make sure that we will survive for another 1,000 more years. Thank you so much, everyone. God bless.
Thank you so much, Okenaisa, calling in all the way from American Samoa. And of course, Professor Vaai from all the way from Fiji, and the appropriate blowing of the conch shell, because of course it is a sunrise for all of you out there, even though it may be the afternoon here on the East Coast. So thank you so much. And Manulani, if you could give us your conclusory remarks, please.
Mahalo nui, Audrey. I just really want to thank all of you who are in Washington. Krystal, Keone, Audrey, thank you for being of service to our people so far away from home. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And Upolu for bringing up the sun. That is a Hawaiian for us, that in this discussion, the sunrise came. That was just brilliant. It's brilliant to hear your thoughts. And Okenaisa, you are brilliant in your Samoa or your Valeno. That's all we deepen our love for each other by knowing who we are and extending that and connecting that. So relationality that I've learned from my friend Upolu is at the heart of how we will recover. And it is not the opposite of racism. It is the genesis of how all things will heal. So what I learned today is that relationality is alive and well, thanks to this anti-racist initiative. We're going to call it something different in the future, okay, gang? Because we're on a movement, and the movement is to heal by doing something. I've had to call it holographic epistemology, because when we called it Hawaiian epistemology, people didn't feel Hawaiian enough. When we call it indigenous epistemology, they didn't feel indigenous. Now we're calling it a hologram. And it actually synergizes with what every single person has spoke about. The wholeness of our lives is the discipline. And this discipline can be found in policies, Krystal. This discipline can be found in historical accuracies, Keone. So all of you folks are doing it. So let's just sing Ulua Ekevelina Akeloha, shall we? I've got 10 more seconds. Here we go. Okay. So there it is. Ulua Ekevelina Akealoha. 2 more times. Ulua Ekevelina Akealoha. Okay, everybody, hum it. Ulua Ekevelina Akealoha. Mahalo.
How beautiful. Thank you so much. I really wish to express my deepest appreciation to all of our speakers for taking the time to share your wisdom, experiences, and observations with us today about the challenges as well as the beauty of the Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. Your words, passion, vision, and inspiration are really resonating with us, and we are grateful to have our awareness raised by your powerful sharing and for educating us and helping us to deconstruct the calcified thinking and mindsets that we may have adapted. And as one of the speakers said, the colonial mindset can also be brought into the minds of the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. But today's conversation has really helped us to go through the deconstruction and decalcification process of the mindset. So thank you so very much. And while we have a way to go before we can say that Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders are treated fairly and equitably, it is very uplifting and hopeful to know that these communities have advocates and leaders such as yourselves, our panelists today. And the G20 Interfaith Forum's Anti-Racism Initiative is honored to have given your voices such important messages, this international platform. And in Hawaii, there is an ancient practice of healing called ho'oponopono, and it means to rectify, correct, and amend, and seeks to seek right relationships through prayer, confession, restitution, and forgiveness. Ihaleakala Hugh Len, the former student of renowned healing priest or kahuna, La Pau au Mornia Simeona, indicated that one has to take 100% responsibility for everyone's actions, not only one's own actions, because everything in the external world exists as an outward projection from within the human being. And he set forth the Ho'oponopono prayer, a mantra as, I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. And I love you. And may these words of wisdom, healing, and forgiveness be on our lips and in our hearts as I close our time together with mahalo. Thank you for joining us today. And aloha nui loa. Farewell with much love. Until we are together again. Aloha, everyone. And thank you from the deepest part of my heart to each and every one of our panelists. You have all made us better people today. Thank you so much. Aloha. Bye-bye. Thank you.